Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative questions of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name's Helen Paynter. I'm Director of the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence at Bristol Baptist College, and I'm delighted that today I'm joined by the Revd Dr Marion Carson. Marion lives in Glasgow, where she serves as a chaplain to Glasgow City Mission. She's also a Senior Research Fellow at the International Baptist Study Centre in Amsterdam. She's the author of several books and articles, including The Pastoral Care of People with Mental Health Problems and Human Trafficking, the Bible and the Church. Marion, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm interested, I know that you've got interest in human trafficking, mental health problems. I'm really looking forward to learning a bit about perhaps if you see any of those themes emerging from today's texts. Just to start us off, do you naturally find connections between your faith and the kind of the news you read or the things you encounter in your work, or do you feel that's a bit, they're separate spheres?
No, it's very, very natural to find connections, not so much with big political themes or party politics, because I'm not really a party politic animal. But I think in my role as chaplain at the City Mission in Glasgow, where I see people affected by homelessness, people in homelessness, people affected by drug addiction and migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, you just can't divorce the two. You know, these social issues of how people are treated with compassion and justice. There's a natural linking of that with my faith. It would be very odd, I think, to divorce them in some way. Yeah. And as a practical theologian, I suppose I'm always thinking about how the scriptures inform how and I suppose also those I work with, what serve the people that come through our doors.
Brilliant. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing some of your reflections in a few minutes. Let me, first of all, I'm going to fess up that we're recording this a little bit early because I'm going on holiday tomorrow. So we're recording this on Thursday, where we normally record it on the following Monday. So I'm going to cover some news headlines. There may be some more things in your news by the time you listen to this podcast. But today, the things that are in our news, and let's face it, they're not likely to be very different, are they? Are that 3 women were killed by a man in Bushey outside London quite recently, and an arrest has now been made on that matter. And this, if the man that they've arrested is convicted, then this will be yet another example of women murdered by men. There's a website and a social media account called Counting Dead Women, which tracks the number of femicides, often domestic, but not always. And it's sadly, it's an endemic problem in so many, well, every part of the world, I think, including our own. Further afield, Palestinians in Gaza City have been told to evacuate as Israel steps up for a new military offensive. Floods in Bangladesh are causing displacement and harm to over 2 million people. The Ukraine is expected to be invited to join NATO. And of course, our new government is finding its feet and looking to make its mark in a whole load of areas. So what texts might you be preaching on this coming Sunday? Well, the lectionary readings are these. 2 Samuel 7, verses 1 to the first part of 14. And this is David's impulse to build a temple and God's reply and the remarkable promise that he makes in that conversation. Then it's Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 to 22, which is another of those glorious moments where the Apostle Paul just kind of lets his theological imagination run rip in this beautiful way. And he gives this account of the dividing wall of hostility coming down. Then we've got Mark chapter 6. And interestingly, we've got Mark 6, verses 30 to 34 and 53 to 56, which is a record of Jesus's teaching and healing, and it misses out the feeding the 5,000 and Jesus walking the water. But spoiler alert, that's coming next week. So we'll perhaps discuss that a little bit as well. And then finally, we've got Psalm 89, verses 20 to 37, which picks up on the theme from 2 Samuel and expands on God's covenant with David. So Marion, thank you for having a look at these in advance and having a think. What things caught your attention, kind of big themes or ideas did
Mm.
you notice?
Well, I suppose immediately it was about housing and homes in the Second Samuel passage. That our big ideas about what we might do for God, and Nathan agrees at first, and then he says, "Well, hang on a minute, maybe there's other priorities you've got just at this point," and David has to go away and think about that. It's not you that's going to do this. There will be a house for the ark, but it's not you that's to do this. And the idea of God saying, actually, I haven't needed a home up until now. I might not even need one now. So all that idea of what we think might be people's needs, and how we think we might serve people. Perhaps there might even be mixed motives in there. Was David thinking, my legacy will be that I have built a house for God that's even grander than my palace, and God says, well, you've really got to look after the people first, and bring about stability, and I will be faithful in all of that. But so it just made me wonder about mixed motives, because sometimes when you're serving people who are homeless, as I do, you have to realize that actually a large part of it can be to make you feel good that you're actually doing something. So that idea of mixed motives and what we think God is asking us to do, and looking at that a bit more closely, was of interest to me. That was the Second Samuel.
So let me just pull on that thread a little bit. So what do you think is a good way of guarding against that very human desire to sort of mixture of desire to help and yet kind of to feel good or take control, or all of those complex things? Because presumably the answer isn't just to run away and put our duvet over our heads and not to try and engage. So how would you advise?
Well, I think it's good to have other people around you who are able to have some sort of self-awareness and to be willing to listen to other people. It looks like David here was willing to listen to Nathan. I'm glad I wasn't in Nathan's shoes, having to go and say, yeah, yesterday I said it was okay, but overnight, well, I think there might be I've had some second thoughts, and I think God might have other ideas. I'm glad I'm not in Nathan's shoes. But I think there's something about we can be very certain of our calling. We can think we know, and it's good for others to be in community, for service not to be a one-man band kind of an enterprise, and to be willing to be accountable to others, to be willing to undertake some self-examination, and be able to admit that, yeah, I believe I'm called to serve people, and I believe I'm called into this ministry, but there will always be a part of me which is there is self-service in there. It's just part of life, you know. I was a nurse years and years ago, just as you were in medicine, and there's always, you're doing your best for the person, but actually we're being paid at the same time, you know. So it's just good to be, I think, part of a discerning community, and be willing to have some self-examination, and be willing to listen to other people, and work in collaboration rather than singly and without listening to others.
Thank you. And that reminds me about something I remember reading quite a while ago about the way some of these kind of, well, I was going to say multimillionaires, but they're richer than that. Some of these really, really rich people who decide they're going to to do something, they're going to invest in something or other to you know, bring blessing, and how actually sometimes they don't consult, and they're not well enough informed, because you have to be extremely well informed to understand the ramifications of what they're doing, how what they do can destabilize fragile systems. It can be something that seems the most worthwhile thing, but actually is something less glamorous, could be more worthwhile. Yeah, there's there's some really interesting themes here, aren't there? And I remember reading a book a while ago called When Helping Hurts, I think, which
Yes,
I think is
yes,
along similar lines. So
yes. Uh-huh.
yeah, thank you
It's a
for
very useful book, and it also shows you, apart from your own motivations, it's very good at pointing out that helping can disempower others, and it's something I think we've got to remember in all sorts of ministry, and for those in helping professions, that we can actually disempower. We can think we know what's best without listening for a start, but we can also make people dependent on ourselves, and we can ultimately, people can just sit back and become dependent. I think that's a very important thing that to remember always.
Thank you. One thing I spotted in this reading before we go on to Ephesians is verse 10. This is God's promise, part of God's promise to David. And as part of this promise, he says this, and I will provide a place for my people Israel and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. And this is, of course, one place of many, many in the Old Testament where we see such language and such promises for Israel. And I just want to flag up that the Israel of the Old Testament just happens to share the name with the nation, with a nation that has that name today. And it's a really a common mistake that people in our congregations might be making when we hear these promises, that they then think that that is somehow speaking into the politics of today. And it's really important that we when we read these texts, actually, that we just kind of make that comment, gradually help our congregations to understand the distinction, that there's a very important theological theme here, and it doesn't go away, but its fulfillment does not look like the events of the last half of the previous century and so on.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that this is it's a narrative text, and I do notice sometimes that there's a book called Ordinary Theology, which looks at how ordinary, by which the author means uneducated, theologically speaking, people. And there's a tendency just to, oh, it says, therefore it must be. And we look for instruction in the text. And it's a natural tendency, probably following on from Enlightenment and so forth. But I think it's very helpful to remind people that this is a story and you don't necessarily need to look for instruction within it. And actually, there's much, much more wisdom in our Old Testament than there is law. But we tend to look for law and universalize things. So I think if I were to be teaching or preaching this, I would be treating it more as a kind of an analogy for life today, rather than looking for timeless instruction, if that makes sense.
Although I think I don't disagree with that, but I think I would also want to be seeing that this is a very key moment in the developing story of Scripture in terms of this great promise that God makes to David, and that really only finds fulfillment in Jesus. So,
yes, indeed.
Well, let's turn to the New Testament then. Let's turn to this amazing passage in Ephesians chapter 2, which I absolutely love. Tell me what you noticed here.
Well, it's all about, for me, it's all about unity. Now, I've mentioned that I work with asylum seekers and refugees, and this passage, the writer talks about, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people, and also members of his household. Now, in the last one, we were thinking about God's house, and you've been tracing the trajectory through into Christ, through that, the Davidic dynasty and into Jesus. And now Paul talks about, or whoever it is it Paul, or is it somebody that really admired Paul? That's a moot point. Now he's talking about the household of God being, well, it's believers, isn't it? And it's what we're back to this thing. Actually, I really don't need a house. And now there's this huge thing in the New Testament about, you are the house. the people of God are the house. And that seems to me to be actually not only an amazing privilege, but a huge responsibility.
Mm.
And I'm not sure that we've carried it out very well. You are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens in God's people and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. In him too you are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. And that means, I think, that we cannot, if we're to think of ourselves as the dwelling, then we cannot be complacent. And we cannot, if we are the ones who are no longer foreigners and strangers, then the thousands of people who are coming into our country and coming to our churches, especially urban churches, are becoming more and more multicultural. Then we have to work very, very hard at making this dwelling one in which everyone feels welcome, and one in which everyone has a place and everyone feels a part of it. And that will mean quite a lot of cultural jostling, I think. I don't mean jousting, I mean jostling on all of our parts. I have known some congregations where, you know, some very long-standing congregations, it's very difficult for new people to understand new people who come in. And some new people come in and think their way is the right way. And I think it requires a huge amount of humility and willingness to be transformed into this dwelling. And we have to maybe let go of some of our cherished ideas.
Yes, we talk a lot about hospitality, don't we? But it's a very kind of tangled idea, isn't it? Because hospitality carries a whole lot of power dynamics. You know, when I say to you, come in, even if I say come in and make yourself at home, I'm at the same time as I'm saying that, I'm asserting that this is actually my home and I get to say who steps over the threshold and who doesn't. And these dynamics all come into when we try to be multicultural in church, which, you know, I'm confident we're supposed to do. But it's tricky, isn't it? Because so often, I remember listening to a podcast, I'm trying to remember the name of it, I'm afraid I can't, but it was three, it was American, but it was three Black pastors' wives who were speaking, and they were all part of multicultural churches which their husbands were leading. So you'd think that in that context, they would have felt very comfortable, but they spoke quite a lot about the discomfort that they felt in the multicultural churches, and they felt that they were totemized sometimes, that they were kind of you know, brought up to the front to kind of as a kind of demonstration of look how inclusive we are. That their sort of their background culture was sometimes kind of fetishized. That there was a whole lot of stuff going on that really good, well-meaning people were doing without kind of really realizing the power dynamics that were at play.
Yeah, I think sometimes you have to admit that cultural backgrounds will naturally, you know, in Glasgow there's Chinese church and Kurdish church and Iranian church, and that I think that's appropriate to help people to worship in their own culture, because we can't expect it's hard for people to change in that respect. But I think what I would like to say is, let's get together sometimes and talk to one another and not remain siloed. It's one of the amazing things at the City Mission, actually. We have people from all over the world. And we just yesterday I was in a Bible study with probably about 15 men, all asylum seekers and refugees.
Wow.
And they were looking at scripture. And some people would say, of course, in the Quran it says this, and other people would want to know what words meaning, what's meant, and the sense of inquiry together was just beautiful. But and it was led by one of our staff who is very, very good at this, inclusive thing, and leading people along, but at the same time allowing the voices to be heard. And we learned from one another, and it's very, very beautiful. Very, very beautiful. Yeah. And this being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit, not moving towards something that will become static, but that is open to the transformation of the people by the Spirit. And it can be extraordinary to watch. I don't really know what's happening. I just know that God is in it.
That's beautiful. And that kind of picks up something that we mentioned in passing in the Samuel reading, because that theme about God saying, I've been perfectly happy, I've been moving about with the people. Why do you want to put me in a building? As you all know, Marion, the theologian Walter Brueggemann says that there's a real kind of discomfort around the building of the temple in Scripture. There's Solomon's just trying to put God in a box, and God's he kind of goes along with it, but there's a sense in which this is just not quite right, because even at Solomon's consecrating prayer, will the most holy God live in? Heaven and earth cannot contain him, but I've made you a little box to live in, and we kind of do the same, don't we?
Yeah, I think we can, and I think it's very easy for us to try to do that, and we don't realise that we're doing it. It made me think also about if we're saying that God is not really concerned with buildings, but he's concerned with us being transformed to become a dwelling in which. But does that mean that we've not to bother with all the beautiful cathedrals and basilicas that we have? And I don't think it does mean that, because I do think that although I'm Baptist by background and I don't tend to inhabit very fancy buildings in worship, but I'm keenly aware that there are people with extraordinary gifts in art, in carpentry, and that people's instinct is to use these gifts to build something for God. And I don't think that should be discouraged at all. So there's a balance to be drawn, I think, that we're not all just sitting in tin huts.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it, that sometimes there's a bit of an inverted snobbery about these things, and yet quite often it comes from people who actually really, really big on professionalization of the music in the church, but then kind of get a bit sniffy about people using other artistic gifts.
Yeah. So I think we need to. God has given us these gifts for a purpose, and they're there to honor him. I suppose I just worry when the building of the edifice overtakes the transformational dwelling place for God. I worry about that sometimes.
If I just take us back to the first part of that passage of Ephesians. So one of the research associates at the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence, Christine Kaynor, is part of something called the Ephesians 2 Gospel Project. And they use this text. Well, their core idea, I hope I'm getting this and representing them fairly, but their core idea is to notice that in this text, the reconciliation, it's not primarily, oh, we're all reconciled to God, and then let's now go and be nice to people. But that the core idea here is that the reconciliation is both horizontal and vertical simultaneously, and that we lessen the gospel when we make it primarily one thing, and then the being nice to each other, as it were, as a kind of secondary thing, which then becomes a bit of an optional add-in, and they use this text, and they work alongside Christians in a number of situations around the world, really, where there is a risk of or actual ongoing ethnic hostility. And there's one story, I'm not sure of the details, so I'm not going to try and locate it exactly, but it was of one particular context of ethnic hostility. And the guys from the Ephesians 2 Gospel Project were in conversation with a pastor there, and they said, why hasn't violence broken out here? Because you can tell it's very tense. And he says, because Ephesians 2 is being preached in our churches. And that was just, it's mind-blowing and extraordinary. So yeah, that's that. Yeah. And the other thing that I love about this, and this is from Willie Jennings, who, if listeners don't know, is an Black American theologian, and he points out here that so sometimes white Christians, this is obviously him speaking, thinking about sort of race tension, but he talks about how often white Christians, sometimes we position ourselves as at the center, and then we kind of say to other people who are not white, yeah, you're welcome. And he says we're getting it back to front, because actually we're the ones who are welcome, because we are the ones, as Paul says elsewhere, but it's very clear here, who are grafted in. God's on the move, and he was on the move back in 2 Samuel when he was talking to David, and he's been on the move. And then gloriously, we who were not part of the covenant have become part of the covenant. But we forget, and we center ourselves and think it's all about us, and that we're the kind of the primal story. Well,
well, I think everybody does that.
Yeah, indeed.
I think it's a human thing. We become the center of our story. What we haven't done is perhaps recognize that. It's the self-awareness, I suppose, I was talking about earlier as well. We have to realize that, yeah, that is a human tendency. We become the center of the story. And again, if we're aware of that, and oh, wait a minute, let's let others become the center for a while, or let us all be together as the center. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, let's go on to our gospel reading, which, as I mentioned earlier, is slightly odd because it's got this kind of big hole in it where, just a couple of minor things happened, like Jesus fed 5,000 people and walked on the water. But before that, we have the apostles who've been out on mission, coming back and telling Jesus everything they've been doing. And he says, let me get you some rest. But then the crowds press in and he teaches them. And then after those two stories, they get skipped over. They've crossed over, and there's another crowd waiting for them, and then he goes and has a kind of a time where he's doing a lot of healing. So what caught your attention in this passage? Anything in particular?
Well, it's really, I was thinking it in relation to the 2 Samuel passage. I did that with all of them, and God said to David, the house is not your concern. Your concern is the nurture and stability of the people, to put it that way. And you're to make the land, somewhere that people can live. And it just struck me that Jesus is concerned. He's concerned with their needs. And he says he had compassion on a large crowd because they were like a sheep without a shepherd. And these are people living in a land which is under occupation. They're oppressed, and he has compassion on them because they're not. There's a kind of lostness about them, and the analogy would be, sheep running about with nobody looking after them, and so that compassion. There's compassion on physical needs, but there's compassion on the need for wise leadership and compassionate leadership. And then he began teaching them many things. So he brings his teaching about a completely different kingdom to bear. And part of his compassion is the teaching. And sometimes I just reflect that we can become in the church very, very preoccupied with the provision of physical needs. It's right that we have food banks, it's right that we have drop-ins, it's right that we have night shelters and so forth. But people do need to hear Jesus' teaching about the kingdom of God. And that's what happened that's what's happening in the place that you mentioned just then. That's what's bringing about the reconciliation. It's the preaching of the kingdom of God. And I sometimes wonder if we don't hear about the kingdom. And once you get stuck into what the kingdom actually might be, it's quite daunting and not comfortable at all.
Indeed,
Um,
indeed.
but Jesus sees that the need for teaching to help people not to be running about like lost sheep. So it's leadership or kingship is to teach about this kingdom. And that's an entirely different kingdom from anything we might imagine on this earth.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It reminds me, and I think probably it's intended to remind me of the story in Kings where you've got an unwise king of, I think it's the Southern Kingdom, but I'd have to check. No, sorry, the Northern Kingdom, Israel. And he wants to go to war, and eventually they find this prophet who comes and says, no, don't go to war. But he kind of sarcastically says, yes, do go to war, but they all know that it means don't go to war. And he says, I had a vision, and I had a vision of all Israel scattered like sheep without a shepherd. And this is what's going to happen if you go to war. And the king doesn't listen to him, goes to war and dies. And it's exactly that, isn't it? It's the foolish leader, it's the lack of wise leadership, and the people being scattered as a consequence. And here we've got the reversal of that, which is wonderful.
Yeah, and perhaps a subtle reference to the passage in Ezekiel where the prophet really railed against shepherds who are not doing what they're supposed to do.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah,
which
and
is...
I think that's very pertinent for our churches, for our leadership in our churches, that we're doing that we're not letting things down by getting sidetracked by things,
yeah,
which are our concerns and maybe not God's.
Yeah, so I think that's Ezekiel 34, if I remember correctly, and that's it's in my view, it's an underappreciated Old Testament passage because it absolutely underlies everything Jesus says about being good shepherd, his parables, and so on. And I think we need to. It repays another read, I think.
Yeah, I wonder how many leadership courses talk about Ezekiel 34.
Yeah, yeah.
Rather than the latest psychology of leadership.
Indeed, indeed. And then finally, we've got part of Psalm 89, which kind of takes us back to the 2 Samuel theme. Anything particularly that caught your attention here?
Yeah, it's the idea of faithfulness. My hand will sustain him. My arm will strengthen him. My faithful love will be with him. And David's being asked to give up his big idea and to do something far less glamorous, but in the long term, far more, well, dare I say, important. He won't be remembered for a big fancy building, but he's got to build up this stability and look after the people's needs and the needs of the nation. And God will be faithful in that. He just doesn't leave him to his own devices. My faithful love will be with him. Through my name, his horn will be exalted. I just wondered, it can be that sometimes our big ideas we have to let go. And maybe what we're being called to do is much more mundane than we would like. But no matter what God calls us to do, I do think we can take from this that if God asks us to serve, he will be faithful to us. I think we can take that, but I am very aware that later on in the psalm, the writer complains bitterly that it looks like God has not been faithful. And there can be times when that looks like it. But I think, like you mentioned earlier on, it's the big picture, isn't it, Helen? It's if we take these passages just as individual units, I've been trying to bring them together, but you rightly brought the bigger picture in, reminding that out of this Davidic dynasty is Jesus himself.
Yeah.
And the whole meta-narrative of God's intervention in history. And that is always so, when we get bogged down in our own little projects and our own little ideas, even though we may feel very strongly that God has called us to do so, I think it's extremely healthy for us to be reminded of the bigger picture, and there will be times when we're railing at God, and thank goodness for the Psalms that help us to do that.
Yeah.
But to be reminded of our the word puniness is in my head, but I don't think that's right. Our smallness in the big picture, and that Jesus is that meta narrative, and that again, and as we're serving, we are being transformed. So I think it helps us to keep our own things in perspective, but we can certainly say with the psalmist that our hands are sustained by him, I think.
Amen to that. Marion, I didn't ask you in advance about this question, so feel free if you don't want to comment. But just as we close out, thank you so much for all your thinking. How do you pray for the world right now? You don't have to give us an exhaustive answer, but other kind of particular things ways that you pray right now for our nation or our world?
I'm naturally, well, as I got older, I've become more and more contemplative in my prayer. So prayer is silence for me. Maybe something like centering prayer is my natural way to pray. But when I'm maybe leading people in prayer, as I do, I will mention the places in the world where there is conflict, like the Holy Land, like Ukraine, like Sudan, and ask God to bring peace. But I'm very aware that he knows. I always remember the Romans passage, we don't know how to pray as we ought.
Yeah.
But I do think we need to cry out and say, Lord, the suffering and the conflict is intolerable. And we cry out to you within that.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Marion, for coming and joining us and reflecting on those passages with us. I hope that I'm sure our listeners will find much benefit from having engaged with the passages under your guidance. And so thank you, and thank you, listeners, for journeying with us. God bless you as you prepare to preach and serve in this coming Sunday on those texts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on X or Twitter, which is @publicissues, or using #PoliticsInThePulpit. And there's a Facebook group you can access through the Joint Public Issues Team Facebook page or the website jpit.uk. So I wanted to finish, I thought, given that theme of temple, and as you so helpfully reminded us, Marion, of us as the church being the temple, and extending that a little bit to think about the priestly role, which is all bound up with it. I thought I'd finish by reading the Aaronic blessing from Numbers 6. And listeners might like to receive this as a blessing, but also remember that as priests, this is our charge, to be this blessing and to speak and enact this blessing over the world. So the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his face towards you and give you peace. And then it goes on to say, so they shall put my name upon the people and I will bless them.